Welcome back to Visited by Voices Live. You know, my favorite of the shows I do is always when I get to talk with someone who I personally have been a fan of for a long time, who's been an inspiration to me. And I've been lucky enough to do that several times, as those of you out there in the chat and watching afterwards are well aware. My guest today, Simon Clark, is one of those writers that really changed my mind on what was possible for people who love the genre, that wanted to get involved, who wanted to actually develop something of value that we could call our own. Simon Clark has a long history. I cannot take the time to read all of his book titles, or else I'd run out of time for the video entirely. But let me just say, he is the author of Blood Crazy, The Stranger, Night of the Triffids, Vengeful Child, Lucifer's Ark, and more novels than most people have probably read in their life he has written. Simon, how are you today, sir?
Oh, fine, thank you, and thanks for having me, Lorne.
You know, it's not a matter of you thanking me. We're overjoyed that you're here. So, Simon, if you had to introduce yourself to those who might not be aware of you, how would you choose to do so?
Well, my name's Simon Clark. I'm from Yorkshire in England. Hence, if you live outside Yorkshire, my accent might sound a little bit unusual. And I'll try not to use any like ancient Yorkshire dialect words, because they can become a bit pretty strange as well. But I'm a horror writer, you know, unashamedly so. And from a very early age, I was interested in stories that were scary, strange, bizarre, frightening. And basically, I think genetically, you know, I'm a horror writer. That's what I want to do, and that's what I want to do forever, basically, for as long as I can.
So it seems like that it is instilled in us, but there's always that inciting incident that kind of explodes whatever gene that is in us to send that poison sourcing through our bodies. What was the inciting incident? What made you get bit by the horror bug?
I was interested in basically, like horror, you know, be quite mild ones, but horror films from a very early age, anything with monsters. But I think what really triggered me with the power of words was, I'll show a book which isn't actually, it's Dylan Thomas. When I was about 11, there was a thunderstorm, tremendous thunderstorm outside where I lived with my parents. We're just in a little village out in the middle of nowhere in the countryside, and I switched on the radio, and this voice came through the radio, this booming voice. It was almost like the thunder itself, and it was, I didn't know at the time, it was Dylan Thomas reading and doing his own reading, and death shall have no dominion. And that, you know, age 10 or 11, hearing those words come out with these really gruesome, macabre imagery about you know, death shall have no dominion, and so on, and about you know, the drowned sailors and so on. I don't know if people are familiar with the poem. I won't read it out because it might be you know, infringe some copyright somewhere. But that really sort of triggered me, thinking, well, if words can have this effect on me, this great, enormous power that electrifies me and frightens me, you know, what a marvelous thing. You know, could I do something like that? And I think probably from the age of 10 or 11, that's really when, you know, the button was hit, and I thought, I want to do something like that. I want to work with words that have such a powerful effect on people.
So what were some of the early writers that you tended to gravitate towards after Thomas actually opened the door for you?
Yeah. I mean, it was years before I actually discovered it was Thomas anyway. So it's probably 10 years later before I discovered that the read on the radio was, during that colossal thunderstorm, was Dylan Thomas. But in the early days, well, I was like, enjoyed children's ghost stories. I used to read a lot of anthologies. I mean, I guess mainly the Victorian ghost stories, just thinking back when I was perhaps 8 or 9. But when I was 13, I picked up a paperback in Woolworths. It was just a few pence, a few cents in a bin that was, you know, just ready to be, you know, they were ready to throw out these paperbacks that weren't selling, and it was Arthur Machen, which included The Great God Pan. started reading this when I was 13. I thought, oh, this is a horror story. I couldn't understand it at all because it was Arthur Machen writing in 1890 in this, polite, correct Victorian English. And I just didn't understand it, but there was some kind of electricity running through the story. Didn't understand it. I'd read a bit and put it away and then go watch Doctor Who on television or something like that, something more immediate. But then I think, oh, I'll read another page. And it got under my skin. Again, I think that Arthur Machen's work about stories about the great god Pan, about strange Welsh mythology erupting into what was his modern day Wales or modern day life, that somehow fused with my DNA again. I mean, I don't know if viewers are familiar with them. There's a parasite that attacks a crab, and in a way, I suppose there's some kind of comparison here. But the parasite gets into the crab, but it doesn't get into the flesh. It actually fuses with its nervous system, something like that. But this parasite fuses with the crab's nervous system and actually, to a certain extent, controls how it thinks and controls its behaviour. And I think reading those early horror stories, something happened like that with me. I mean, a happy parasite, a joyful, wonderful, benevolent parasite, perhaps, that it fused with my nervous system. These horror stories I was reading, and by the time I was 13, I thought, I want to be a writer. That's all I wanted to do. I thought, somehow I'm going to become a writer, and I'm going to write about these things.
I feel somewhat underdressed now. I mean, I started reading as a child, reading the Charles L. Grant Shadows anthologies and Stephen King's Night Shift. You were doing Mackin. I mean, next you're going to tell me that, Robert Chambers was right after that, and I'm going to feel really small.
Oh, right. Yeah, I discovered, when I was younger, I was reading things like Dennis Wheatley, Devil Rides Out, because horror was such, fiction was so limited. And then along came Stephen King, James Herbert, reading Carrie, perhaps late teens. And of course, that was visceral, immediate, now horror, set in modern times, in supermarkets, in, people drove cars, they didn't go in handsome cabs, they were driving cars, they were watching TV, they were listening to Bruce Springsteen on the radio. It was, suddenly, horror became modern and, obviously extremely visceral, immediate, and it felt so fresh and now.
And that's an interesting transition that I was planning on anyway. So thank you, sir. From the 70s and the William Peter Blatty and the Thomas Chiron and Stephen King years, we came to the 80s, which was already a big jump. That was already taking horror out of the castles of old England and old London and Europe and into like the suburbs, into the world we actually lived in. But then in the 80s, we got and into the 90s, we got this big jump to kind of the mindset of the people that were reading, truly like connecting on a level that even those guys hadn't quite done. And you were part of that class eventually. But people like Jack Ketchum and Liz Massey and Brian Hodge and Kathy Koja were taking what had been done before and bringing it even more modern into the years of like the Gen Xers could relate to. And certainly my introduction to you was Blood Crazy. And Blood Crazy is an amazingly fast-paced, modern, relatable story to someone exactly the age I was when I read it. And I had never read anything that was, to use your words, that immediate. I just hadn't. Maybe some short stories and like the Skip and Spectre anthologies and stuff like that. Maybe Barker was almost there, but there was a big jump in that time period, and I think you were on the forefront of it.
Oh, thank you. I guess it wasn't planned. I mean, I don't know if there's people watching who perhaps just starting on the road to becoming writers and horror writers. But I made the big mistake, what perhaps lots of people do when they're writing fiction, that they wrote about things basically didn't know. They set a story in ancient Egypt, and I was doing the same, or Australia, New Zealand, places I've never been. But with Blood Crazy, I thought, well, I wanted to write a gripping horror story, but I thought, well, now I'm going to set it in my hometown, and I'm pleased I did. I mean, again, if I can give any advice, set a story or a novel in a place that you know well, perhaps the school that you went to, or the factory you work in, or even the supermarket that you go to. And with Blood Crazy, I don't know what it was. I seemed to hit something that then like broke open a reservoir under pressure, and it all came gushing out. When I was writing it, it seemed as though I had a drum beat going in the back of my head all the time. You can see where the hair's gone now. Probably this drum beat was
Same
going.
place mine went.
This rhythm.
Our hair is hanging out together somewhere else.
That's right. Yeah, it's gone somewhere. We share the same stylist. But whilst I was writing that novel, I had this almost like this drum beat going all the time. This very fast drum beat, and the story has shot out of me. Without even almost like thinking about it. It could be one of these cases that I've been working on the story unconsciously, deep down inside my head for years and years, and then suddenly I managed to break down the door with all this pent up story, these ideas, and they just came flowing out. So yeah, it was strange to actually write the story. And when I did write it, Blood Crazy, I didn't have a publishing deal. It was times were tough. So plenty of writers can quite honestly say that, and probably identify with that. I'd had no novels published at that time. I'd written Nail by the Heart, that was unpublished. It was being rejected by every publisher you could mention. So I just thought I'd just write it for myself. If it never gets published, it doesn't matter. I've written something that I'm proud of, and wrote from the heart. Just let it come out. And unfortunately, it was published. I mean, if I don't know if I'm going to jump ahead with any of the questions that you've got planned, but like getting my first pro-publishing deal. Like I said, I'd written Nail by the Heart. I'd written Blood Crazy. I'd sent Nail by the Heart to an agent. He wrote back saying, "Oh, it's okay, but not good enough. Don't, just put it in a drawer." And I thought, "Oh, I could really be best about this." And then in the meantime, I'd sent Blood Crazy to Hodder and Stoughton in London, but very big publisher, British publisher. And I had a phone call from a guy called Nick Austin, who was the editor, and he said, "Oh, I'd like to buy Nail by the Heart." And so I just said I'd sent Blood Crazy. I hadn't sent Blood Crazy at that time. He said, "But we'd like to publish 2 novels." And I said, "Oh, I've just finished one called Blood Crazy." And he just said, "Oh, great, we'll publish that as well." And then, pow! It was such a brain eruption, basically. I sold 2 novels in the space of 2 minutes. And then I thought, well, I'll phone this agent who I'd sent the novel to, who was a very good horror agent, who represented Richard Lehman, who published, when he was a publisher, he published Stephen King and plenty of the horror novelists. And so I phoned him up and said, "Oh, yeah, you've written to me and said, he said some nice things about Nail by the Heart, but he said he didn't think it was, could be published yet." And he immediately went in, probably a little bit defensive, thinking I was going to phone up and say, "Oh, you should be publishing this, you should be publishing it." And he's saying, "Oh, put it away, think about it for a while." And he was obviously giving me a bit of the talk about, don't bother me, basically. And then I just jumped in and said, "Oh, by the way, Hodder and Stoughton want to buy 2 novels." And he said, "Simon, leave it with me. I'll get you a good deal." And so I just got an agent as well within probably 10 minutes of the call from Nick Austin at Hodder and Stoughton.
It's funny.
Sorry, I'm talking too much now.
No, you're talking. You're the reason we're here. But it's funny. Agents change their tune when something's pre-sold, don't they?
Yes, I mean, it was such a turnaround because you could see he was being very defensive and being polite, but basically wanted me to, he wanted to get off the phone and he wanted to hang up. And when I said, "Oh, Nick Austin wants to buy 2 novels," he was saying, "Oh yes, I know Nick. I'll give him a ring. I'll do the deal for." And so everything fell into place remarkably quickly then. Yeah, after, from zero, from being absolute nothing to, being.
It's remarkable though, because when we hear these stories, and there's no shortage of these short stories from writers, Nailed by the Heart today is a small press classic. I mean, it's something that will stay in print and limited editions probably for the rest of your life. It'll continue to keep popping up. So it has definitely found its fan base.
Yeah, and I think and Blood Crazy certainly has. I mean, Blood Crazy's been published in. You might, I don't know if you got the edition, the leisure edition, Dorchester. It's been published in Russia, Greece. I'm losing track of places. Japan. It's been optioned for a film, for a movie, which never really happened, but it was great to be optioned. But yeah, with Blood Crazy, I mean, I went to a convention in America, and I was, doing the signings at the tables, and a guy came across and said, "Well, are you Simon Clark?" And I said, "Oh, yeah." And he said, "You wrote Blood Crazy?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I didn't know you were going to be here." He said, "I brought my copy of Blood Crazy to be." He said, "Do you mind if I just nip out and get it?" And I said, "Yeah, no problem." He said, "Oh, I've got to drive 50 miles. Will you still be here? Don't worry. If you want that signing, I'll stay here till you get back." And goodness knows how fast he drove, but he was back in about 2 hours. It must have driven so fast that the paint sort of like was blazed off his car with the speed of it. But he came back with this copy of Blood Crazy, which was very well thumbed, and he said, "I just lived with this book," and it was a joyous thing to be able to sign it for him.
It's so funny. There's nothing better than being presented with one of your books that is well worn. That's so much better than a book that's been treated like a Fabergé egg. I mean, when I presented William Peter Blatty with a copy of Legion, and my copy it's not in great shape, let's put it that way, because I reread it constantly. That's the thing he said to me. He said, "I love seeing my books this way."
Yeah, I think it shows the book's being loved, doesn't it? The more wrinkles and creases a book has, the greater it's loved, and the more it's read, and the more it's referred to. I mean, I can't actually reach, but I could pick up my copy of the back copy of Stephen King's The Shining, and I've read that so many times. But also, I'll just pick it up every other day and read a page. And sometimes I can make notes and think, "Oh, Stephen King's using that, that's well worth thinking about. Might use that technique as well myself." But there's some books that you just want to go back to. I mean, I'll do the same with Dylan Thomas. Just go read a few lines. It's not writing so much as with Dylan Thomas, Stephen King. It's incantations. It's magic. It's they can reach into your heart and tinker with all the buttons there.
Absolutely. Now, before we get to, because we're starting to get questions in the chat, and I want to make sure I don't ignore them, but before we do, I just want to give you the opportunity to tell people what Blood Crazy is about, because I have a feeling that a lot of the audience here are well versed in especially film and horror, and I think if they hear your elevator pitch on this title, they'll need to run to Amazon as soon as the stream is over to pick up a copy.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, it's between publishers at the moment, but people can probably get second-hand copies, and I certainly don't mind. If they can buy a copy that's been cherished. But with Blood Crazy, I mean, one of the jumping-off points was one day I was walking through town, and I guess like in the States, you have level crossings where the train goes across the road, and of course they have to close the road off. And this was a busy road. Kids were coming out of school. The gates came down to close the road off as the train went by, and as soon as the traffic stopped, it was a really busy road, or would be normally, but all the traffic stopped, and all these kids coming out of school suddenly started laughing and went out and spilled out into the road and were walking on the cars. They loved it that the cars had stopped, and they could for a couple of minutes reclaim the road. And I thought, well, what would happen if it happened forever, if the cars stopped running forever, and if adults for some reason either disappeared or even became strange and dangerous, and that was basically a jumping off point. So I wrote the book back, I think about 1993. Wrote it very quickly, I think 3 or 4 months, because like I said, the story came out, and basically it's about everybody over the age of 19 becomes murderously insane and attacks their own children. Quite a heavy duty horror story. And it's basically just the children, the teenagers have got to survive, and they're basically constantly on the run because the adults. It's sometimes described as a zombie novel, but the adults aren't zombies. To a certain extent, the minds are top sliced. The IQ is reduced to 50 or whatever, but they become murderously insane, and they can't abide children. I describe it as the Jungian horror as opposed to Freudian horror. Basically, the idea that almost like Jung had that the mind's evolving, and the adults are going through a mental evolution, but for a period of time it overwhelms them, and they just become murderously insane, and they try to destroy their own children.
So
sorry.
Is it fair to say that if you could, is it fair to say the math is George Romero's The Crazies meets Lord of the Flies?
Yes, I guess so. Yeah, I hadn't seen the Romero film, but I'd read Lord of the Flies.
Because you have that aspect
of about children surviving
and creating a society to survive, right? So yeah, I love the novel.
Yeah.
All right, so the few questions coming in. Lost Cunningham, a regular here. Timmy, he's a big reader. He says, Simon, was it daunting writing a sequel to Day of the Triffids? I love that book. He's talking about Night of the Triffids.
Oh, right. Sorry, I didn't catch that. Was it Lost Cunningham?
Yep, Lost Cunningham.
Oh, thank you for the question. Anyway, Lost Cunningham. Yes. Oh, thank you for that question. Yes, incredibly daunting. I wrote the book sitting in this chair in this room, and it was a labour of love to write this sequel to Day of the Triffids. Again, it was my own idea. I wasn't approached to write it. Because I loved the original Day of the Triffids about these big green plants that can walk and kill people and take up the world. I guess most people are familiar with the story, but it's another end of the world story. And I got the chance to write it, and I had to write it very quickly, so I was often writing late at night in this room. And quite often I feel almost like a shadowy presence standing behind me. And I started almost to think John Wyndham's come back. His ghost is here to watch me over my and read what I'm writing. And hopefully, I was thinking, hope he approves of what I'm doing. But it was a great labour of love to write that, and it was incredibly daunting. I hope I was faithful to the story. I knew I couldn't mimic John Wyndham's style exactly because he's such a good writer. I'm not up to that standard, and I just hoped that I could actually, that there'd be a flavour of John Wyndham in the Night of the Triffids. And it seems to have been a popular book. It's again published in Russia, in several other countries, lots of European countries. Quite recently, there was an Estonian edition, and Big Finish produced an audio edition, an audio version of it, which I was fortunate enough to be able to adapt. And it was broadcast by the BBC later, so that was very nice.
That's awesome. And I think you're cutting yourself a little bit short. I do think there's a lot of John Wyndham's voice that made it into your novel. And yeah, it's not going to be exact because you're not him, but I felt that it was a lot closer in tone and in voice than probably you're giving it credit for.
Oh, thank you. I did try. I mean, I'd John Wyndham's original novel on as an audiobook and just listened to it over and over again on what was a Walkman back then. I'd walk the dog across the fields and I'd be listening to it all the time. And hopefully something would, those kind of rhythms would find their way in there, and I'd be able to reproduce them.
Jess Graham asks, what other horror material has inspired Simon in his work? I guess he's saying books, movies, audio dramas, radio shows, puppet shows, anything that inspired.
Oh, thanks, Jess. I mean, I guess in the early days, a lot of it was children's television. And one thing that really did, I mean, this seems crazy now, but what the British TV used to do for children's programming about 5 o'clock in the evening was to take an entire movie, chop it up into 4 or 5 pieces, and show it as like a kind of TV serial. And about the age of 5 or 6, for some reason, they thought that the movie On the Beach would be great for very young children. And again, I don't know if people On the Beach. It's about a nuclear holocaust. It's about
It is.
The world being wiped out. Well, it's a really horrific, terrible story to show on TV. And thank goodness, when I watched it, I was hooked on it. And a big part of the story is it's set in Australia. There's been a huge nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere, and the radiation's creeping down. The people in Australia are going to be okay for about 12 months, but eventually the radiation will reach them and kill them. So, they're going to the beach, surfing, having barbecues, going to the bar, drinking beer. But they know this death is creeping ever close. And at the time, it just scared me silly. It was just so frightening. And it probably gave me a dread of nuclear war, which continues to this day. So that was a big thing. But perhaps other stranger stories, things like I think it's a Czech film called Singing Ringing Tree. Again, this was a film chopped up into sections and showed for children. And it was this film made in the old Soviet bloc times. And it's a magical story of a princess, and the world is enclosed in ice. It freezes up. And basically, it's quite a psychological story. It's basically about her emotions freezing up. And she's cold, distant, and not a pleasant person. But I think now, looking back on it, it's her emotions have frozen the world. And so she's moving through this icy landscape that's quite dead and scary. And it's a fairy story. Again, that would sort of go inside my head and probably fuse with my DNA. And later, I love catching up with things like Quatermass, H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds movie, Twilight Zone, and then moving on to perhaps like grown-up fiction. Things like people like Stephen King, James Herbert, Clive Barker. When I first read Clive stories, again, it was things. It was, it's just a incandescent explosion inside your head. Because you read good horror, but then Clive Barker comes along with his books of blood, and the stories are rough-edged on the page. They're just fantastic, vivid, visceral stories, and his writing's just right. It just leaps into your mind and paints such vivid and often very gory pictures. But there's a whole lot. Even things like music as well. Bands like Joy Division that wrote this doom-laden music. You listen to that and you can see in your mind's eye bleak wastelands with skeletons and skulls and strange creatures roaming. It's that kind of the baseline is enough to make you imagine those deep chasms filled with writhing monstrous forms. So yes, listen to Joy Division if you're interested in horror writing. Check them out.
Absolutely, Joy Division and Bauhaus and Sisters of Mercy. You actually mentioned a couple. You mentioned one On the Beach, and that made me think of some particularly British perspectives on a couple of films that are close to my heart, because they're really British experiences, not American experiences. So I have no right to claim them. But both Threads and Ghostwatch are particularly interesting moments. Yes. When a very particular brand of British paranoia was just unleashed on the world. Did either of those have a big impact on you?
They did, yes. Both of them. And it shows with British horror, it is strange. The idea of British horror, it can be like Ghostwatch, where the ghost appears to be in the plumbing, in your house. It's might not be a big monster, but it's there in the plumbing, or Midwich Cuckoos, which it was filmed early 60s. And there, the notion is that the monsters are basically polite children and that's it. I mean, the children don't do a lot initially. I mean, it gets a bit nastier later, but it's basically the horror there. The monsters are just these polite, well-dressed children who walk around in little groups. But yeah, Threads. I mean, I've got a friend called John Travis who I meet up with at conventions, and he bought Threads on DVD, and he says, "Oh, you got to buy it. It's out on DVD." And I keep thinking, "Oh, I'll pay it." I remember watching it first time around, and that scared me again. Nuclear war, and it was filmed only half an hour from where I live now, so that probably had a big impact, because I knew the city where it was filmed. But again, such a terrible, bleak story of nuclear war, that with no real heroes in it. Everybody just basically is reduced down to the most lowest life form in a way. They're just scraping the dirt, literally, trying to find enough to eat. And Steve Volk's Ghostwatch. I meet up with Steve Volk at conventions. And a great guy. I mean, he writes great short stories as well as great scripts. But Ghostwatch, I watched that before I knew Steve, and it was screened on Halloween on British TV. But they pitched it as a kind of like light entertainment reality show. It wasn't pitched as drama. So when we sat down to my son was probably about 5 or 6 years old, and perhaps a little bit older, and he watched it because it was quite a few comic actors in it, and we thought it was just going to be a silly, fun show with jokes and so on and pranks. And because Ghostwatch turned into this very scary haunted house story, and it got too much for my son, and he had to go to bed. I don't know whether he slept after that, but he didn't watch the whole thing. But yeah, I mean, again, you could say that Ghostwatch is typically British. It's in some ways, I won't say it's a small story, but it focuses on just a very small group of people as a rule. And initially, you think that when they're talking about the ghosts, it's living in the plumbing.
Mr.
And,
Pipes.
it's a bit of a comedy story, but then it becomes it's Quatermass-like.
And I don't want to derail this too big into just British cinema, but Quatermass is one of those things that I feel like it kind of flew under the radar in America. I mean, 10,000 years BC. I mean, you have this entire concept of, it's almost Lovecraftian, but it's in a very science fiction mold rather than a horror mold. But where it really, really succeeds is it's the most obvious precursor to things like the X-Files.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, because you have the investigative scientist who's uncovering the Quatermass himself, investigating these strange events. I mean, I didn't watch them first time around. I hadn't been born. The TV version, and then Hammer remade some of them in colour. But just the background to Quatermass. I mean, they were actually performed live, almost like a theatre play, often at Alexander Palace in the tiniest of studios. Which, if you combined, our two rooms together, Lorne, that probably was the size of the TV studio that they used.
Exactly.
But it was so effective and so powerful. I watched one or two of the Quatermass on TV, but they weren't available on DVD at that point, or on VHS tape in the earlier days. What I managed to find was the scripts in book form. They were published by Penguin, and I read the scripts, some of the Quatermass stories, Quatermass films or TV series, and they were just brilliant to read. I mean, if you can get hold of the Quatermass in script form, again, it's. I mean, you talked about flow earlier. They just flow along. I mean, they're nuclear powered. You start reading them, and you can't stop. I mean, they just move along so quickly. They are brilliant. So I'd certainly recommend that, if you haven't seen Quatermass, do so. But I further recommend that you get the TV version rather than the film version. I mean, there's personal preferences, but I like the Quatermass and the Pit and the original TV version, which I think is that you say 10,000 Light Years to Earth? Is that the American title?
Of the film version, I believe, yes.
For the Martian,
But I believe
where
that
they
Anchor
discover
Bay
the
did
Martian spaceship.
in the subways, yeah.
Yes, yeah. And then they
Yeah.
discover it. Yeah.
I believe Anchor Bay did put the television versions out on DVD, but I don't think they in America. But I don't think they've surfaced on Blu-ray yet.
Yeah.
I could be wrong though.
Yeah. Dare I say, you might be able to find some little bits and pieces of them on YouTube. You know, that could be worth. At least give yourself a taste of them. I mean, if you can get hold of them, do so. Things like Quatermass in the Pit and Quatermass Experiment.
Okay. They're very good.
Yeah, I mean, I think Nigel Neal, who wrote them, was very successful in tapping into people's psyche. A lot of in the early, probably in the 1950s, it was a bleak time for Britain. I mean, rationing in Britain didn't end until about 1953, and it was still a bombed place. It was still a smashed up, destroyed place after the Second World War. They're still rebuilding, and there's I think it was probably quite a grim, depressing time, and I think Nigel Neal could tap into those fears and anxieties, and the British Empire was collapsing, and Britain was no longer a superpower, and I guess both John Wyndham and Nigel Neal could tap into that and reflect those fears back at people at that time. Think, who were just really struggling, literally out of the ruins of World War II in the 1950s.
We always talk on the show about horror only really works if it reflects real world fears and real world anxieties that we have. It just exaggerates them. The classic example, of course, is Amityville Horror is about not being able to make a mortgage payment. But you have to be able to really connect on some level. So our friend Richard, our friend Richard, who runs the YouTube channel Are You Into Horror, which is a great channel about horror literature, asks, he says he just recently read Nailed by the Heart and wondered where the strain for it based on people you knew. He loved the books.
Oh, thank you. Oh, no, hi, Richard. Thank you for the question. I guess the character of David, the little boy, is based on my son, who was about when I was writing the book, he's 5 or 6 years old, and so it was that point, that parent thing, that when you've got young children, you start to see through their eyes, and you start to see things that wouldn't scare you, scare them. It could even be something like like a sound of a toilet being flushed could be scary, and that made me think back to when I was a child. And it's probably in the too much information file here, but I remember when I was a child, if I flushed the toilet when I was about 5 or 6 years old, it's happened during good water. When I flushed the toilet, I had to run out really quickly with my hands over my ears because it's so loud. And then for me, I thought, well, is that like a monster coming up out of the toilet to get me? It's and so with Nailed by the Heart, I found myself looking through my son's eyes at the world and thinking what might be scary. And also, it was a parent thing. If your child develops a cough or they've got a bit of a fever, you become scared for them. You worry about them. And so, to push it to extremes, I had an idea of putting Davy's mother and father in a position where they wanted to convert an old seafort hotel. And these seaforts are these old Napoleonic forts on the coast, which are on little islands. And so the idea is that, obviously a hideous thing to do is to put a family out there on this remote little island with a fortress on it that's, be cut off by the tide, and, got a bleak place. And then just to add into the mix, there's a shipwreck a few years before, and then there's these like zombie creatures break out of the ship, live underwater, and when they discover basically there's a family there, they think, oh, we're going to get this family. So basically it becomes a siege story with these like bright red zombie-like creatures who basically wanting to kill the people there. But not, I guess, let's go back to Richard's question. I think writers do what they usually do, is to take a little bit of, a little bit of Tom, a little bit of David, a little bit of Arnold, a bit of James, and so on, and put them together. So you to form a character. So apart from my son sort of appearing in the book as a character. All the other characters are just inventions, but perhaps with a pinch or two of real people in there.
And even if you start basing them off a person, they kind of evolve with the story into what they need to be. It's kind of an inevitability.
Oh, they do.
Jake,
Yeah, I mean, one thing. I say.
no, Jacob is saying that he doesn't know why they keep making movies like Mom and Dad when they have Blood Crazy as the perfect blueprint. Hallelujah, sir. Hallelujah.
Yeah, I salute Jacob there. Yes, I totally agree. Yeah, Blood Crazy was optioned for a while. Was it Jacob's? Yeah,
Jacob also asked if you have any particular films that you are inside the genre that you particularly love.
Oh, it's quite a few, I guess. I mean, some perhaps aren't that quite obvious as horror. I mean, we're just thinking now. I mean, certainly some of the classics, like I remember watching like Bride of Frankenstein when I was 10 years old. Yeah.
To this day, yeah,
it's amazing. You know, I've never seen it on the big screen, but I'd love to see that. Yeah, so something like the classic horror films there. And more recently, yeah, Elsa Lancaster, yes. Oh, fantastic. Yes, yeah.
knocking things over is what I'm doing.
Now. Yeah, I'm envious, Lorne. I want that. But yeah, I mean, it's like the classic Frankenstein's, Quatermass. I grew up from a very early age watching Doctor Who on British TV, which, you know, it was supposed to be this science fiction TV series, but it was horror. I mean, it was shown on perhaps 5 o'clock on a Saturday evening on BBC One. Yeah, and it was basically horror stories, and it was monsters, it was Daleks killing people, and it was, you know, lots of scary stuff happening. So that played a big effect on me.
So let's
more recently.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Just more recently, things like the Russian TV series, The Method, which I think is on Netflix still, and that's such a gruesome, you know, violent TV series, and I think being filmed in Russia against quite a dreary urban backdrop, and I mean, I'm sure that there's plenty of places in Russia that, you know, beautiful buildings and so on, but in The Method, they all seem to choose the broken down with the peeling paint. You know, I believe they call it was it step down imagery in filmmaking, to, you know, film in a semi ruin, or was it like Nostromo on Alien with the spaceship with the water and liquids and oils dripping out of pipes and things, and everything's really like filthy and you know, and quite unpleasant, grotty, as we'd say in this country, or in Yorkshire we'd say, oh that's really grotty. I mean, it's, you know, pretty awful. But yeah, I can recommend The Method if anybody's seen that. But yeah, I've absorbed so much TV and film. This thing about Steve Volk's Ghostwatch, you know, obviously. Like Twilight Zone, things like Stranger Things, and so on. The question. You know.
Yeah, Regiment is saying Vampiric is one of my all-time favorite books. Can you talk about it a little bit, about your inspiration for it and how the sequels evolved?
Oh yeah, Regiment. I know Regiment. That's Gina. Hi, Gina. And
hey, Gina.
I think she's in Texas now. Yes, I know, Gina. Thank you for that question, which I actually was quite missed because I just realised it was. The question was about Vampiric.
Yes, she says it's one of her favorite novels, and she wanted to know a little bit about the inspiration behind it and the sequels.
Yeah. I mean, again, it was this thing about you know, which I'd heartily recommend to writers: set a novel or a story in a place that you know, even if it's just an experiment. You know, set it in your own home. You know, set it in, you know, the room that you're in now. But with that one, I mean, a new. Well, it's set in Yorkshire, and well, just the gist of the story. It's a vampire story, but I wrote it in the mid to late 90s. It was when Buffy was famous, and there was lots of vampire stories that were more romantic stories. But I wanted to really bring vampires back into the, make them horrible and violent, nasty and violent. So I decided to set a vampire novel in my home county of Yorkshire, and partly in Whitby, which, of course, in days gone by, in Bram Stoker's Dracula, Dracula makes landfall in Whitby, but I set it in modern Whitby now. So it's a contemporary story, but it's basically about Viking vampires. Because again, where I live in Yorkshire, this was a part of the Viking Empire 1,000 years ago. And so, the gods that were worshipped here were, Thor, Odin. When I'm sitting now, there's even a Viking graveyard just across the road. They've got Viking bones and Viking jewellery. A lot of the place names in Yorkshire Viking. I grew up in a village called Thorpe, and that's a Viking place, and it means Ordlin's village. A Viking called Ordlin. So I wanted to write a really bloody, gruesome, nasty vampire story, and set it in a place that I knew, which people like Dick Lehman have written things like this. They can set them in places they know, like in California. And I set mine in Yorkshire, and I thought, well, I'm going to bring the Vikings back, and then the Viking undead are going to be the vampires. So, they're a pretty bloodthirsty lot of warriors anyway on the whole. You used to do the thing, with the blood axe, which was to chop people down the middle and pull out the ribs. Oh no, that was Spread Eagle. No, what's that? Blood Eagle, wasn't it? So I'm misremembering now. Sorry, long. But yeah, they used to do a lot of very gruesome things. It's like, capture monks and nail them to the abbey doors. Goodness knows what parts of the body they nailed there, but they do all kinds of awful things. So I thought, well, if the Vikings came back, they probably still have the appetites for bloodshed like they had in the past. But now the vampires, and won't literally drink people's blood to stay alive. They're going to be some, gruesome, nasty monsters. So, Vampiric is my first vampire novel. And when I was writing, I was saying to people, I think I'm going to write a vampire novel. This is going back to the late 90s. And people said, oh, Simon, don't write a vampire novel. The vampires have had it now, that they're dead-based, people have had enough of vampires. I thought, no, I'm going to go ahead and write it. But of course, then the doubt creeps in, and when I actually sent the book to the publisher, I thought, oh, we're going to hate this. They may have hated it anyway, but they published it. But then it was a really big success. Again, published in Russia, Greece, Spain, Italy, Dondoria at Dorchester brought out a paperback of Vampiric. Cemetery Dance did a hardback. I've even seen, I don't know if people have, I really should have the book here to be able to hold up like that, because the Dorchester edition has a beautiful, actually, paint, the artists use brush and paints to paint this wonderful cover, and I've seen that reproduced on people's like legs. They've had it tattooed onto the skin, the cover. This artwork, I think it was the artwork that drew them rather than the actual story. But if Blood Crazing's available at the moment, the Vampiric is. So anybody who's tempted to dip into any of my work, I'd suggest perhaps Vampiric initially. You can even download a free sample from Amazon on Kindle and read the first chapter or so. But I'm very proud of that book, and it sort of weaves in my interest in like mythology as well as. I'm not interested in mythology in like an academic sense, but I love the ancient mythology, the ancient legends, the stories, because they're they're so ancient, and you feel as though that they are, they flow through our blood as much as the blood does. These stories, some of the old myths and legends, I'm sure, originated perhaps in Africa 70,000 years ago when we first could speak. they've just been handed down and flowed across the world. You know, they've ridden our bloodstream to Europe, to America, to Australia, and so on. So that's something I try and do with writing is bear in mind like the mythological stories, and see if we can get some echo of that into my work.
Well, definitely. I mean, the rural folklore of every age becomes mythology eventually. And horror has always been a big part of that. I mean, probably the first thing ever written was, the big cats are really dangerous. If you leave the cave, look out for the big cat. And that is basically a horror story. It's probably the first horror story. Just because we don't have it in past history doesn't make a difference.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the first stories were these cautionary ones that perhaps, because we're always be also educational as well, especially I guess for the younger children in the caves. You wouldn't tell the story about the lovable cute rabbit attacking people. They'd be sat around the campfire and say, well, if you go out at night and there's you see the lion, basically as fast as you can, and there'd be something in the story as well. There'd be it would be educational. It would be the internet of its age. Because the story like they've been chased by the lion. Could say there were three people who were chased by the lion. One ran up a tree. The lion ran up the tree, ate them. The other one jumped in the river and swam across, and he or she was safe because the lion couldn't swim. There'd be some kind of there would be a point to the story. It would be gruesome, and it would hook the people, the adults as well. But there'd be education there. There'd be a tip, a hack to escape the lion with your life.
Yeah, and it's just, you always have to figure out that the first person who walked out and was mauled by a lion, when everyone else saw that, they weren't thinking lion. That was a gruesome, almost godly monster at that moment. So the stories become embellished in a far larger fashion, and that's a tradition that continues to this day. The horror genre is the oldest genre of expression, not even just literature or anything else, of expression, because we've always faced danger in our world, and we've always wanted to express to others that we face this danger. What's the point of surviving something if you don't pass it along? So I think in any...
Yeah, that's it, because sorry, Lorne, that's such a good point. I can pick up on that. Yeah, it's the survivor stories that we hear and educators, I guess, don't we? I mean, you can look at like mythology and
And that's why I think that horror, unfortunately, has been relegated to the ghetto for so long, but yet it's probably the most important genre with the best history. Now, I'm not saying every moment in it has been important. That would be ridiculous. But just like the slasher wave of the late 70s, early 80s was a response to what was traditionally thought of as urban crime spreading out into the suburbs. There's a correlation there. It was a primal scream of a declaration. It wasn't a necessarily intelligent reaction. But it's important as an indicator of what was really going on in the society.
Things like invasion of the body snatchers, the fear of communism. Apparently that's where it stems from. But I mean, sometimes I think of horror story. It's not perhaps a very elegant comparison, but I think everybody has little fears. Sometimes big fears. Without talking about what's happening now, which is clearly horrible with the pandemic. But they go through life and they have obviously big fears about illness and things, but there's lots of little things, can I afford to pay the mortgage? Well, that's a big thing. But I mean, some bills are coming up, or perhaps you worry about your a family member who doesn't look so well, and I think these fears that are just like going to your head and they ferment and they're there and they just build up and build up, just sometimes just tiny little fears, but they're just there and they grow perhaps in your subconscious, that almost ferment to become something else. And I think if you read a good horror story, it's almost like a vacuum cleaner. It hoovers up those fears. It gives you, if you read a prolific horror story or you watch a horror movie, scares you. I think in a way it's quite therapeutic, and it does deal with those fears. I mean, we know by the heart, one of the first trips I got, somebody said, "Oh, when I finished that book, I went around with a great damn smile on my face." That which surprised me. And he said I just felt so good at that, and I thought, oh, perhaps it did succeed in hoovering this reviewer's small fears up and converting them into something that that wasn't threatening him anymore or a worry anymore. And for a while afterwards, it read a big, hopefully gruesome horror story, but then it made him cheerful. So if it can do something like that, I mean that's great. I mean, it didn't set out to do that, but that seems to be the result.
Yep, we're just punching our straws into the zeitgeist and sucking back whatever we can get. That's pretty much what the horror writer. You can use that quote. I'll tell you what. As long as you attribute it to me, you can do it on every one of your books ever. How about that?
Oh, definitely. Oh, thank you. That'd be brilliant. Cheers.
So I think the reality is, if you have 60 people watching a stream, there's at least 3 to 8 of them that are absolutely fixated on Doctor Who. So we have to go there.
Right.
So Doctor Who played a part in your growing up. You were one of the kids that infamously hid behind the couch. That's fair to say?
Yes, yeah. And was genuinely scared by it. I watched Doctor Who from a very early age. In fact, I'm old enough and hopefully not too admit that I watched the very first one back in the early 60s. And watched basically every one since then as growing up. I was probably about 5 years old. But Doctor Who back then in the 60s, it was basically every week that it was on. And it was just something that captivated me and scared me, which is, again, an odd thing. I think, oh, why watch something that scares you? But I mean, it's this thing almost like education. You felt as though it was scary, but perhaps I was learning something that helped me survive. I mean, I didn't probably know that consciously, but probably, intuition was telling me, watch this. Watch Doctor Who, and if you meet a Dalek coming down the street, you know what to do. The old joke about Daleks can't climb stairs, so escape a Dalek by running up the stairs. But so I grew up watching Doctor Who, playing with Doctor Who toys as a very young kid, and then much later I got the chance to actually dip your toes into the Doctor Who universe and actually do a little bit of work in there.
That's where we were going. So you actually write Doctor Who Dalek. I'm sorry, the title just escaped me.
The Dalek Factor. The Dalek Factor.
Could not read my own writing.
Yes.
I'm not actually a Doctor Who fan, but that had to be kind of a dream come true for you, to be able to go full circle, to go back to your youth and kind of crouch behind that couch again, but this time you were in control.
It was, yeah. A guy called David Howe, who ran Telos Publishing, still does from Telos Publishing, and is a big Doctor Who fan and Doctor Who historian. And he approached me and said, "Oh, Simon, I want you to write a Doctor Who novella. Are you interested?" And I said, "I'm not going to do it. No, I won't. No, thanks." Because it was just too big in my mind. I thought, well, if I write a Doctor Who story and it's absolutely awful, I'll have ruined Doctor Who, which I grew up loving. And it's too dangerous to tackle something like that. He said, "No, you can do it. Just write it as write it as a horror story. It doesn't have to be a science fiction story. Write it as a horror story, but it just happens that the Doctor's in there." And again, I think most of your viewers will not be familiar with Doctor Who. It's this time-traveling eccentric, and it gets into all kinds of scrapes and dangers and adventures. And so, every telephone would go, I'd pick up the phone and, give it How, and it'd say, "Oh, Simon, are you going to write that Doctor Who story for me?" And I said, no way. I'm too scared to do that. And then he said, "I've got something that might interest you." And I said, "Go on." And he said, "Well, if you write it, I've got permission to use the Daleks." And I said, "Yeah, okay." yeah, definitely, I'll write it. And so that's how the Dalek Factor was born. And when I did write it, I thought, I've got to make Doctor Who scary. I'm going to do everything I possibly can to make it, horrific, disturbing, quite a grown-up, macabre, grisly tale, a bloody tale, and then perhaps even go down a bit of the Clive Barker route of being so, visceral body horror. And so I wrote something that was, almost like a Spinal Tap thing. They had turned the dial all the way up to 11 on the Marshall amplifier. It's really something loud and big story. I mean, hopefully there's some subtle parts in there. It couldn't all be full on gruesome stuff, but it's a real thrill to write the Dalek Factor. And that was in the late 90s, and the Daleks hadn't been seen on TV for a long time, so there was lots of interest in that, and it was made the national press, and I think it sold very well worldwide. The book, so it was so thrilled with that. I've also worked on other Teddy Nation creations. I mean, Teddy Nation worked in Doctor Who, and also created the Daleks. And they also created a TV series called The Survivors in the 1970s. Again, about a post-apocalyptic event where 99.9% of the human race is wiped out, and it just leaves literally a few survivors. And Big Finish rebooted the series as an audio drama, so I got a chance to work on that as well, and I wrote some audio dramas, which was a terrific thrill.
So Simon, the one question that every writer hates to hear, but is, do you have a favorite of your works? And I don't want to hear about your children, how they're all like your children. You can't choose one. But is there one that resonates with you more than others, and that you'd suggest people to start their journey into your fiction with?
One of mine. This is where I have to put my bow slide on. Well, Blood Crazy isn't available at the moment, but the second-hand copies out there, and by all means, if you can get hold of it, either second-hand or in the libraries, that's definitely been the novel that really seems to have really got into people's psyches and really captivate them. But if you would like to buy a novel that's available, I would suggest Vampiric. That seems to have been very popular. I mean, there's a lot of books out there. There's one called Stranger, which is Blood Crazy like, and that's available. It's paperback and ebook. Also some anthologies some anthologies out, such as Big Book of Blasphemy is out this year. I've got a historian there, edited by Gina Mitchell and David Barnett. Say that Vanity. I should put my glasses on, shouldn't I? But I can't see the screen properly for the glasses.
One or the other, man. One or the other.
I'm having a similar problem to you, that things are falling off.
Well, my problem is I build stacks of things all over the place, so it's all my own fault.
Yeah, I've done this. And Strange Days, edited by Trevor Denyer. He approached me in Glasgow last year at FantasyCon and said, I'm editing this anthology, would you like to contribute? And he says it's basically about where the world's turned upside down through various events. You pick which event it is. But basically, it's a world. It's basically where the other world's gone wrong, and he pitched that idea to me last year. Well, and of course, within three or 4 months, COVID came, and then the world was turned upside down for literally everybody. So I don't know what Trevor Denyer was dreaming about, but he seems to have had a glimpse of the future when he came up with this idea.
Awesome. But, so it sounds like Vampiric is a novel to start with at the moment, and then when Blood Crazy comes back, jump on it. But you really can't go wrong with your body of work. You're gonna. Everyone will. Go ahead.
sorry, if you take a look on Amazon, there's quite a few books out there, and a lot of the books are end of the world stories. I was, fascinated by, the apocalypse and civilization being wiped out and people starting again. So yeah, there's a lot of books out there that of mine. If you want to dip your toes in, and again, with Amazon, best not just talk about Amazon, but ebooks. I mean, you can get a sample and read a chapter, and if you hate it, you think, I'm not going to buy any Simon Clarke books, but hopefully we'll like them.
That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. So Simon, can you do me a favor? Could you ask me what's coming up next on the show?
Right, Lorne. If you could tell us what's coming next, because I certainly enjoyed this, and I think people, viewers will enjoy your future shows. So, if you let us know what's coming up the road.
Thank you, sir.
I've seen the dark universe yawning, where the black planets roll without aim, where they roll in their horror unheeded without knowledge or luster or name.
Yeah, so I'm not giving myself much rest this week. Simon, I want to thank you for coming on today. It's been amazing to hear from you, and definitely don't be afraid to come back whenever you want. But how can people stay in touch with everything Simon Clarke and keep abreast of what's coming next?
Probably best via Twitter. I don't tweet a lot, but occasionally tweet about new books, or if there's some book that's on a special deal or something like that. But Twitter would be best.
Awesome. I also want to thank everyone who participated out there in the chat, and everyone who viewed in, whether you're too shy to make a comment or not. Special shout out to Jess Graham and Alice Asperia, Jamie, Lost Cunningham. Tim, how are you, man? Jacob. Who else was very vocal? I'm looking through the chat real quick. Richard from Are You Into Horror? Everyone, please go check out his channel. It's pretty amazing. We had 4021971. Thank you all, and Regiment. Thank you all for making the chat so lively today. And as I return you to your regular scheduled day, I just want to remind everyone that what we're doing here is talking really about something we love. It's not the rest of the world that intrudes too often on us. So please, do yourself a favor. Those things you love, whether it is reading a great Simon Clarke novel or watching Day of the Triffids on VHS, please do yourself a favor and take the time out every week to do that. Because especially now when the world seems to be getting tougher and tougher, the little pieces of joy will take you further and further. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Crisp, flavorful fish sandwiches, golden brown and crunchy outside, and tender and juicy inside for a snack or a meal.
Hey, somebody's crazy. Papa goes the weasel. Everybody knows the weasel blows.
We have lots of pretty pickles waiting for you at the refreshment center. They're plump, tender, mouth-watering. Wouldn't one taste good right now?